nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika-prana Natha-pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasya Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsabho Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito. Nama Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam Dantoyer Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dṛśyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Vilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasada Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Madhukari Atupada Padme Ya Bhakti Nikhilartha Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya. Shri Radha Ramana Param Bhajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakar Kuryat Rajalokavat Gurutara Prem Naiva Tasyai Nama Yaram Ya Nikilagha Shanga Shamani Shrotratitim Sangata Ya Svadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhuti Karya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. And if I could ask that others just mute their mics for the time being, just to prevent any background noise. So today we'll continue discussion of verse 92. So we're in the section on Sotsukya Prarthana, or prayers filled with eagerness. And eagerness, as we discussed previously, is defined in the Sindhu in the context of vyabhichari bhavas or sanchari bhavas, as feeling such intense desire that as a result one cannot pass the time. One is so eager, one feels as though one is unable to pass time. So prayers that emerge from that timelessness, if you will, are called sotsukya prarthana. So one such prarthana or prayer is found here by an anonymous author. So last time we read the verse, and today we'll look at some discussion of its import. So I'll start with the verse again, and then we'll come to discussion of the comments. āsvādyaṁ pramadā-radacchadam śravyaṁ navaṁ jalpitaṁ bālāyā iva dṛśyam uttama-vadhū-lāvaṇya-lakṣmīr prodghoṣyaṁ cira-viprayukta-vanitā-sandeśa-vāṇīva naivedyaṁ caritaṁ ca rūpam aniśaṁ Śrī Kṛṣṇa nāmāstu te. O Śrī Kṛṣṇa, may your offerings be for me pleasing to taste, like the lips of a beautiful young woman. Your deeds pleasing to hear, like the new speech of a young wife. Your figure pleasing to see, like the beauty of the loveliness of an excellent young bride. And your name pleasing to proclaim, like the words in a message for a long separated lover. So we have Krishna's naivedyaṁ, the offerings to him, in other words, the prasad of what has been offered to him, his deeds, his charit or his lila, his figure, his beauty, and his name. So the name, the form, the lila, and his prasad. These are the four elements in the verse. So these are compared to four elements that, or four elements of worldly experience are used to compare or to express the state of eagerness or the state of longing that the author wants to convey in relation to Śrī Kṛṣṇa, or rather the desire that he wants to have, the desire for these things. In other words, when he says, may your offerings be for me pleasing to taste like the lips of a beautiful woman, it can be read to say that he wants to desire them the way a person with what is called vishaya-rati, or attachment to objects of the senses, feels for that object. So we'll look today at discussion of this idea of raga, or attachment, and how it's the basis of the path of bhakti that Rupa Gosvami has called raga-nuga bhakti, and the primary means to achieve prema or priti, and we'll look at how Jiva Gosvami has also defined priti, and done so with specific reference to worldly priti, and to a manner of priti which is akin to the type of priti, or the type of attachment or fondness that's described in this verse. So while sometimes as students of the Goswami's works we may style ourselves as staunch transcendentalists, or think that we're very much concerned and interested in things that are purely, so to speak, purely spiritual or purely transcendental, we see that these concepts are taught by reference to things which are as entirely worldly and sensuous as anything can be, and that the attachment which is found to objects of the senses and the attachment which is found to spiritual objects shares like characteristics, and it's this likeness and characteristic of the nature of attachment that is had between these two objects, which is how one thing is pointed at by reference to the other. So, without further ado, this is quite an important topic to trace out what precisely is the nature of the priti that is the aim of every sadhaka in their path of bhakti, and how even these references to what for many are some of the most prominent forms of worldly attachment can also be indicative or can also be reminiscent of the spiritual attachment that one aspires to. So, the commentator summarizes the import of this verse by saying that deep attachment is suggested by each of the four examples in this verse. Quote, attachment, raga, is defined by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras as, quote, that which closely follows pleasure, sukanushayi raga. The commentator Vyas, who is not Vyasadev, but a particular commentator on the Yoga Sutra, explains this sutra as follows. Quote, the desire, the thirst, or longing for pleasure, sukha, or a means to that, preceded by remembrance of pleasure, of one who has past experience of pleasure, is called raga, that is, attachment. So, in order to desire something, you have to have a concept or a past experience of it. So he's saying when someone has had experience of this thing called pleasure, and they have remembrance of that experience, then they can experience desire to, again, have that experience, or to achieve the object whereby the pleasure that causes, the object that causes the pleasure is attained. So, sukanushayi raga, then, is that which closely follows pleasure. In other words, attachment is what emerges from the experience of having pleasure, remembering that experience, and then the resultant feeling of wanting to have it again. So, pleasure is the axiomatic element, or in other words, it's perceived to be what it is directly, or it's felt to be pleasure, and then that creates the samskar for it. The samskar gives rise to the thought of the object that triggered it, such that one pursues the object, such that one again has the experience. So, in that way, there emerges what is here called raga, or attachment, this thing that follows, or in other words, which is the outcome of experiencing pleasure, attachment to the means that created it. So, Jiva Gosvami, speaking about raga in this sense, defines ragatmika bhakti. Sri Jivapad introduces the subject of ragatmika bhakti in Bhakti Sandarbha by, similarly, defining the term raga in accord with its intended sense in the term ragatmika bhakti as follows. A sensuous person, or a vishayis, natural affinity, constituted of intense desire for contact with objects of the senses, or vishay, is called raga, attachment, as in the case of the natural affinity of the eye and so forth for beauty and so forth. That is, of each of the senses for ideal forms of their respective objects. So you have vishay and a vishayi. You have the object, and then you have the person who's prone to or who's within the scope of experiencing that object. So when the vishayi and has experience of the vishay, there then emerges this natural affinity for the vishay. Or in other words, when the vishay, the object, produces pleasure, then there emerges raga, or this affinity for the object, because it's a cause of pleasure, or a means to pleasure. So this is automatic, and this is existing here. It's significant that Jiva Gosvami explains that this natural affinity constituted of desire is related to each of the objects of the senses for the respective objects. So this doesn't, in other words, it's beyond something that's purely intellectual, or the object and the sense, when an object that's well suited to a sense come together, this is the outcome. There may be some influence that the way one conceives of it can have on the process, but it's not entirely created by that. In other words, the attachments that we might feel or the pleasures that we might feel, these are more or less computations taking place by the cognitive system. So, now relating to the spiritual matter, Jiva Gosvami says, something indeed similar. That is, a similar sort of natural affinity constituted of intense desire, of a bhakta also for Sri Bhagavan, is here in the context of ragatmika bhakti called raga. So what's significant here is how he says tadrisha eva, which is similar specifically. So by saying similar, he doesn't mean same, or he doesn't mean that it's entirely the same thing, but it shares a certain characteristic. It shares a certain similarity, and by having an experience of one aspect, then we can acquire, to some extent, an idea of what the other may be. In other words, because we've all experienced the affinity constituted of desire for contact with objects of the senses, then this idea that a bhakta could feel such affinity, this desire, and then this emergent affinity from that desire for Bhagavan, this we can have some idea. So it's quite interesting that the fundamental premise of how ragatmika bhakti is conceived, which is the fundamental premise of how the entirety of Vrindavan and the plane of our spiritual aspiration is conceived, is explained by reference to the most immediate basic experience of material cognition, or what you might call literally sense gratification. That as he's saying, contact with objects of the senses. So this experience we have of the senses being gratified by objects, desire emerging from that pleasure, and then affinity for objects or affinity for that experience emerging from that desire based on that pleasure, that one could feel that same sort of affinity, that same sort of automatic inclination and automatic satisfaction, so to speak, in a relationship with Bhagavan. This is the impression we can gather from this teaching, or this is what we're told is called raga. So just as we love our, favorite food, let's say, then these bhaktas love Krishna. They don't have to try, it's not a struggle, it's just happening automatically. It's just there for them. They just relish that. They just feel this natural inclination for Krishna, just as we feel inclination for things of this world. So, laid down this concept, bhakti, which is then made up of such raga, or bhakti, or acts of service, which are an expression of feeling this natural affinity based on desire for Krishna, this is what is called ragatmika bhakti. So, Sri Jivapad elucidates both the similarity and distinction that exists between the attachment raga, experienced in conventional worldly life, and the attachment or raga that bhaktas feel in regard to Sri Bhagavan, in his explanation of the nature of priti, or prema, for Sri Bhagavan in Priti Sandarbha, with reference to the following prayer of Sri Prahlad Maharaj. So this is a very, very significant section, perhaps, or arguably the most significant section of the entire Priti Sandarbha. In other words, where priti or prema its actual essential nature is delineated, and based on this verse of Prahlad. Ya pritira vivekanam vishayra ya pritira vivekanam vishayesha vivekinam anusmaritastam hridayan mapasarpatu. As I continuously remember you, O Bhagavan, may everlasting affinity or priti for you, which is possessed of a characteristic like the affinity or priti which the undiscerning have for objects of the senses, never slip away from my heart. So I've added this bracketed statement, possessed of a characteristic like the affinity which, because this bracketed characteristic is, conceptually speaking, the gist of Jiva Goswami's interpretation of this verse and his drawing out the intended sense of its import. So that will be explained as we go on. And the reason is that it can be problematic if it's read literally. In other words, if we say, may everlasting affinity for you, which the undiscerning have for objects of the senses, never leave my heart. In other words, let me have love for you as a Vishayi has love for Vishay. If you take that literally, then you're saying, I want the very material attachment that I feel to material things. I want to feel that material attachment, but for you. So is the attachment that the Brajabasis have for Bhagavan, or that Prahlad has for Bhagavan, is it the exact same thing as the material attachment that materialists have to material? No, it's not exactly in entirety the same thing, but it shares a significant characteristic. So what Jiva Goswami teases out is, although the literal meaning of Prahlad Maharaj's statement is just saying the attachment or the affinity that the materialists have for material things, let me have that attachment to you. What he's actually saying is, I want attachment to you that's like the attachment that materialists have to material things, but it's not entirely the same. So in what sense is it alike? In what sense is it different? That's what's essential to grasp in this delineation. So we'll dive into this. So Jiva Goswami goes into this as follows. Priti's intrinsic characteristic, or Swarup Lakshana, is shown by Prahlad in Sri Vishnu Puran by means of analogical extension, or what is called atidesha. Ya pritir avivekanam. That is, Prahlad Maharaj, there's a typo, makes known the intrinsic characteristic of priti for Bhagavan in this prayer to Bhagavan for such priti. Quote, which and that, or ya and sa, as found in the verse, mean of which characteristic and of that characteristic, and not rather simply which and exactly that, because of a oneness between Bhagavat priti, that is priti for Bhagavan, and Vishayi priti, that is priti for samsaric objects of the senses, solely on the basis of a particular characteristic which is shared by them, to be discussed ahead. So it is not that Prahlad Maharaj prays to have for Bhagavan the same priti that the undiscerning have for objects in samsara, but rather that Prahlad prays to have Bhagavat priti, which is distinct in nature from Vishayi priti, yet also possesses a characteristic that will be explained ahead, namely being constituted of favorability towards its object, or anukulya, that Vishayi priti also possesses. So now let's just quickly look back at the verse we're talking about here in the Padyavali. May your offerings be for me pleasing to taste like the lips of a beautiful young woman. So if we apply this in the view of Prahlad, then the pleasure of tasting the lips of a beautiful young woman would be a pleasurable object for the avivekis, or the undiscerning. Or, you could put that a little more bluntly, but I'll be polite and just say the undiscerning find this to be an object of great pleasure. So the poet is saying, may offerings to you, or may your prasad be a cause of pleasure for me, the way the lips of a woman are to an undiscerning person. Or may I take pleasure in hearing your deeds, may I feel this affinity, this priti, for hearing about your lila, the way a newlywed takes pleasure or feels affinity in hearing the speech of his wife. So we can see that in this prayer also, it's as if he's praying for the very same priti. In other words, it's as if this material priti that is being mentioned in these examples, that he's asking to have that same sense of pleasure, that same sense of attachment. So through this analysis of Jiva Gosvami, we can understand that, or we can simply interpret, this is an anonymous poem, maybe that is what that poet had in mind. It's hard to say what the poet had in mind, but if we read the verse in the lens of Jiva Goswami's analysis, then it's not that the prayer is made simply to have the same exact sort of affinity or pleasure, but rather to have spiritual attachment, devotional attachment, which shares the characteristic of being a type of natural affinity. So what's essential then is to grasp how that spiritual attachment, or that spiritual affinity that's being prayed for, what exactly is that, or what is the characteristic of that, such that we can have a clear conception of what it is that we seek, and such that we can actually pray in an efficient way, pray for the thing that would actually be the best thing to ultimately ever experience. So therefore this commentary is, in my personal opinion, highly relevant in this case. So, still, because of a simultaneously also coexistent distinction between these two types of priti, on account of the former's being constituted of a function of the Maya Shakti, and the latter's being constituted of the Sarup Shakti, this, that is, the following explanation, is stated. Certainly by the word priti, happiness, synonyms for which are joy, jubilation, delight, bliss, and so forth, is referred to. And fondness, priyata, symptoms for which are love, tenderness, affection, and so forth, is also referred to. So basically, Jiva Gosvami is saying the word priti has two meanings. It can mean pleasure, and it can mean love. Or it can mean the happiness or the satisfaction that one feels, and it can mean fondness or affection or care for something. So it can mean sukh, and it can mean priyata, fondness, affinity, what have you. So when Prahlad is saying, let me have the priti that the undiscerning have, which type of priti is he talking about? In this regard, sukha is a particular form of awareness constituted of elation, and priyata, fondness, is a particular form of awareness constituted of favorability towards its object and filled with elation caused by experience of that object as a result of desire for that object arising from favorability towards that object. So this is very technical language, but this is actually the philosophical essence of what priti is in this statement, which he'll also repeat again later. So he's making a distinction between these two types, or these two different cognitive objects, if you will, that the word priti can refer to. So when we say pleasure or happiness or satisfaction, what are we talking about? We're talking about a particular form of awareness or a state of consciousness that's made up of a feeling of elation or some lightness, some rising, whatever you want to call it. Whereas priyata, or fondness, is something more than that. It's something which is fundamentally constituted of favorability towards its object. And it also contains this elation or this excitement or this pleasure, and that pleasure is caused by experiencing that object as a result of having desired that object, and this is the kicker, and having desired that object out of favorability for the object. So this is the difference between the mundane and the spiritual. In other words, we desire the object not out of favorability for the object. By we, I mean materialists like me. We desire the object because out of desire to please our own mind. In other words, we're desiring the thing because it pleases us. Not that we're desiring the thing for the sake of pleasing it. I love pizza, not because I want to, make pizza happy, but because pizza makes me happy. I love ice cream, I love this, I love that. So when we say we have, quote, love, we're using the word in a way that corresponds more to the first sense, that we experience a state of awareness constituted of elation because of an object. But we're not really saying that we experience this elation because we have the desire to please that object, or because we're inclined to bring well-being or satisfaction to that object, and we're becoming elated as a result of desiring that object, which based on that favorability for the object that we have. The common example in the world would be like the love of a mother for her child, where she desires to see the boy, let's say, because, come home from school, because she takes such pleasure in bringing joy to the boy by feeding him his afternoon snack. So she's, experiencing a state of awareness, which is constituted of favorability towards the boy. She wants to please the boy. She wants to perform action, which is favorable to the boy. And that's also filled with elation. And it's caused by an experience of the object, or the boy, as a result of desiring the boy. And that desire itself is arising from favorability for the boy, because she wants to bring satisfaction to the boy. So this is how the two different ideas of priyata and sukha can be distinguished by reference to conventional experience. But as we mentioned, Jiva Gosvami is making a distinction between both of these things, be they constituted of Maya Shakti or be they constituted of Chit Shakti. So in that way, although there are these two elements, there's also a distinction in their constitution. Now, therefore, although the quality of sukha, happiness, is present in this, namely in priyata, or fondness, there is a distinction in priyata from the former, that is, from sukha. The opposites of these two, namely sukha and priyata, are respectively misery and hatred. So in other words, there's the negative feeling from an object, and then there's the aversion or the enmity or the hate of the object because it's perceived to be a cause of suffering or pain or what have you. With the establishment of the word priti being a synonym for both sukha and priyata, here in Ya Pritira Vivekanam, the word pritis being only in the latter sense and not being the former is clear. So Jiva Gosvami is saying that when Prahlad says, I want the priti that the avivekis have for Vishoy, for you, he's saying, I want this priyata. I want this fondness of you, which is emerging out of favorability for you, which is based on a desire for you for the sake of favorability, or coming from favorability for you. Because of priti, the object of which is a son or otherwise, being constituted of favorability towards that object. So the example I just gave, this is the example given by Jiva Gosvami. I'll just say it again. Because of priti, the object of which is a sun, or otherwise, being constituted of favorability towards that object. And because of priti for Bhagavan too, being of such nature. That is, because of Bhagavad priti too, being constituted of favorability towards Bhagavan, there is certainly a likeness in characteristic shared between Vishay priti and Bhagavad priti. So the love of the mother for the son, which is an expression of favorability and desire out of favorability and elation coming from that favorability, this type of fondness, as it's seen in the world, that is similar to, or it shares a characteristic with, priti for Bhagavan. So it's not that the two are identical, but it's that they share this same, set of psychological underpinnings, if you will. Therefore, it was rightly explained earlier in regard to the correlative pronouns ya and sa, or which and that which and that mean of which characteristic and of that characteristic. That is, it was rightly explained that the analogy in Vishnu Puran between Bhagavad priti and Vishay priti is an analogy based not on a constitutional or complete equivalence between the two types of priti, but rather on a likeness between them on account of a particular characteristic shared by them, namely favorability towards their object. Thus, in this way, by means of the example of Vishay priti, priti for Bhagavan is defined as. Now here's the full definition he gives of Bhagavat priti. So if you want to boil this whole commentary down into the crunch, this is the crunch. Or what is the definition of priti for Bhagavan? This is it. A particular form of awareness, constituted of favorability towards its object, filled with desire for that object arising from favorability towards that object, and so forth. That is, as was stated earlier in regard to the meaning of priyata, fondness. Thus, the full definition of Bhagavat priti is a particular form of awareness constituted of favorability towards its object, namely Bhagavan, and filled with elation caused by experience of Sri Bhagavan, as a result of desire for Bhagavan arising from favorability towards Bhagavan. So when we desire an object and we get the object, then we feel what he's calling ulas, or elation. We got what we wanted. So when we desire an object, we may desire it out of favorability for that object, in other words, for the sake of the other, what you could call parartha, or we desire the object for the sake of ourselves, merely for the effect that it causes in us, so that would be called svarta. So when our underlying aim is the pleasure of the self, and our object is svarta, or our own self, the favorability, or the favorability being defined elsewhere by Jiva Gosvami as rochamana pravritti, or pleasing action, or acting which is causing pleasure. So when the person that is being pleased by the action is the self, and the action is aimed at self-pleasure, or self-favorability, and then out of that self-favorability we desire an object, and then we get the object, and then we feel elation because we have the object, or we get to experience the object, then this is Vishay priti, or this is, svarta priti, if you will. But in the case of Bhagavat priti, it's not that the person is desiring Bhagavan principally for the experience that they themselves will have. Now, it's no unknown secret that the experience of Bhagavan will produce bliss, a vast number of orders of magnitude of greatness, beyond any sort of material pleasure that could be had. There's no more satisfying, there's no more wonderful object of experience that can ever be conceived to exist. So there's no doubt that the person is also going to feel elation. But here what his point is that nevertheless, although the pleasure of experiencing Bhagavan is so great, those who have this spiritual priti for him, their desire for him and the elation that they experience from that desire is fundamentally a desire arising from favorability towards him, or it's fundamentally arising from the act or the pursuit of pleasing him. So this is why he made that earlier distinction and explained that priti here means priyata, which I'm giving here in English as fondness, or you could say affinity. So, like experience of the sweetness of objects of the senses. Now look again, how do we understand what is Bhagavat Priti, what is Ragatmika Bhakti? Again, the analogy is simply sense gratification. It's simply the most immediate experience that we have of worldly life. The experience of the sweetness of objects of the senses, however, like that, however, experience of the sweetness of Bhagavan is different from that. That is, from Bhagavat Priti, meaning experience of Bhagavan's sweetness is another state of awareness that comes about as a result of Bhagavat Priti, just as experience of the sweetness of objects of the senses is a state of awareness distinct from Vishayi Priti that comes about as a result of Vishayi Priti. So the other point here is that something is really felt to be sweet when we already have a desire for it, based on a samskar for it, based on a past experience of it. So in other ways, you can say that its bhav is instrumental in the experience of madhurya, or when you already have an affinity for something, you desire something out of that affinity, and then you get the chance of experiencing it, then you can feel it to be sweet. So this applies to worldly things as well as spiritual things. So he's again making this reference to how the psychology of worldly experience to help us understand the psychology of spiritual or devotional experience. So, Śrī Shukadev Goswami similarly speaks of attachment or raga, that is, the natural affinity or vishayi priti, that sensualists have only for women, but just for talk of women, as an illustration. He speaks of attachment that is natural affinity that sensualists have not only for women, but just for talk of women, as an illustration of the attachment that Bhaktas feel in regard to Sri Bhagavan and discussion of him. So if you're a hardliner follower of Jiva Gosvami and you like Bhagavat Praman for everything, then here you go. Here's Bhagavat Praman for the same point, which he makes on the basis earlier of Vishnu Puran, which we can find in this verse of the 10th canto. And again, I'm giving this here because it's also relates again to that very same element of, the idea of the attractiveness or the pleasure experienced in talk of women, which is also the subject that's used right in the verse here in the Padyavali that we're talking about. So, in the 10th canto, we get the following verse: Satam mayam sarabritam nisargo yadartavani shruti chetasamapi pratikshanam navyavad-achyutasya yad śravyaṁ iva sadhu varta. This is the nature of sadhus who grasp the essence. They for whom discussion of achyuta is truly as though ever new at every moment, even though it is already and always the object of their speech, hearing, and mind. Just as discussion of women is as though ever new for sensualists. So in other words, as those who are attached to women find discussion of them ever new, so those who have raga, so those who have attachment to Bhagavan, find talk of him as though ever new. And even if they engage in it all the time, still they feel it to be so. They never tire of it. Or, a similar analogy might be like sport. Still people can talk about how they kicked the ball in the goal. It's the same thing again and again and again, but people, every day again and again, they're glad to watch someone else do it again and talk about the way they did it and how they did it and so on. So, Sri Jiva Pad illuminates the import of this illustration as follows. It, that is discussion of achyuta, is truly as though ever new at every moment. That is, it appears as though unprecedented, with some uniqueness in relishability. For those who grasp the essence by virtue of having deep attachment to achyuta. Moreover, when deep attachment alone is the cause in the case of newer and newer sweetness, arising from the referent of the word women, or woman, even though that referent is actually an object of utmost aversion, for those who grasp the essence by virtue of being of purified mind and vivid discernment. How much more so does newer and newer sweetness arise from Sri Bhagavan, who is the very essence of the highest eternally ever new bliss, when one has deep attachment to him. This is the purport. So I have to say, in my personal opinion, I find this particular comment, and in particular his use of the word padartha in this comment as a particularly clever kind of, I don't want to use some excessively informal slang in this case, but some kind of like awesome, righteous, classical Sanskrit pundit way of dealing with something. In other words, the word padartha is as a grammatical and a classical philosophical way of speaking of an object. But it's a way of speaking of the object in a way that's slightly removed. So padartha literally means the object of a word, or the referent of a word. So he doesn't just say here that a woman is an object of utmost aversion, but he says the referent of the word woman. like it's like, I'm not even gonna say just the word woman here, because that would imply that I'm cognizing a woman at this time. So just that word called woman, it has this object. And that object is like this. I personally just find that very interesting, the way he distances it like that. And in the spirit of what he's saying at the same time, this is personally one of my favorite remarks of Jiva Gosvami. But anyway, that's just a personal note. Regardless, this statement is highly insightful. So what he's saying is that, or what he's bringing out here, is that the anurag, or the attachment that one feels, is the cause of the ever-fresh pleasure and experience that one has in the object. If you don't have that type of attachment, that object won't produce that same type of experience. For, who are called in this verse of the Bhagavatam sensualists, the woman is the source of ever new pleasure in being discussed. For the sadhu, who's mentality is very different than such a sensualist, rather, Jiva Goswami is saying that very same object is one of utmost aversion. So the object is the same, but because the mentality is different, then the experience of the object, and thus the attitude towards the object, is very different. So this is what he wants to bring out, is that the quote-unquote sweetness, or the level of elation that one feels by perceiving an object, is significantly informed by the type of attachment or non-attachment that one has towards the object. So then he adds a kaimutya nyaya, or what's called, a fortiori reasoning, and saying, when just having affinity, even for a material object, which is necessarily always limited, defective, incomplete, etc., no matter what it is, when even one can experience ongoing, fresh pleasure in continually perceiving that object, when one has this thing called anurag for it, then what would you experience when you have anurag for Bhagavan? What would you experience when you have anurag for an object which is infinitely, eternally, ever new and ever more wonderful? In other words, when you put the greatest intensifier of the way the psyche can be attuned in connection with the ultimate object that the psyche could possibly experience. Put those two together, that's what the Prem Bhakta feels, that's what is the name of the game, that's what's your quote-unquote ordinary day in the world of Braja. So, this whole discussion is coming out to, if we look at it back in the context of the verse in the Padyavali, when he's saying, let me feel pleasure in taking your prasad the way another man does in, tasting the lips of a woman, he's saying, let me have this type of full, great affinity, this type of anurag for you, for the objects related to you. Then I'll really experience them. Then I'll really experience them as they're, so to speak, meant to be experienced. And if one has that type of anurag for the most wonderful potential perceptible object, namely Bhagavan and his Leela and his Prasad, then it goes without saying that that person will then become utterly detached from all other objects and thereby, so to speak, automatically in a state that transcends entanglement and samsara. So, through this analysis, Sri Jiva Pad makes it known that it is a perceiver's attachment to an object that is the primary cause of the perceiver experiencing sweetness, that is pleasure, as a result of perceiving the object. Although the relative excellence of the characteristics of the object of perception undoubtedly also contributes to the degree of sweetness, that is pleasure, experienced in the perception. In other words, it's both. The author's prayer in the verse under discussion, that his Ishtadevata Śrī Kṛṣṇa's prasad, lila, figure, and name always be pleasing to him, is thus a prayer with eagerness to have deep attachment to his Ishtadevata Śrī Kṛṣṇa's prasad, lila, figure, and name, and to convey the intensity of his eagerness and the intensity of the attachment he prays to have, he makes comparison with sense objects that are known to be highly desirable and pleasurable to persons with Vishayi Priti, that are perceived with the same senses that sadhakas perceive Śrī Kṛṣṇa's prasad, lila, figure, and name. So we can now render the gist of what comes in this verse of the Padyavali as follows. So this is like you could say, an extended rendering of the verse and is based on the way the commentator describes it. So, as the lips of a beautiful young woman are most pleasing to taste for her lover as a result of his intense longing for them, so may the remnants of offerings to you, your Mahaprasad, be my solely longed for and relishable object of taste. As the soft and shy speech of a virtuous young wife, just becoming accustomed to speaking to her husband, is most pleasing to hear for her husband, so may your deeds, your leelas, be my solely longed for and relishable object of hearing. As the beauty of the loveliness, the shimmering within the limbs, akin to the waviness and the luster of pearls, of an excellent young bride, is most pleasing to see for her bridegroom, so may your figure be my solely longed for and relishable object of sight. And as for a long separated lover, the words in a message from her beloved are most pleasing to repeatedly proclaim. So may your name be my solely longed for and relishable object of speech. So regarding the second example about the speech of a young wife, there's has a little bit of a cultural aspect to it, in that typically young women before they're married are very soft-spoken or aren't considered to speak much publicly or with persons outside the family. So when a young woman is married, then it's the first time in her life where she's speaking much, and especially speaking with persons outside her immediate family. So there can be a lot of shyness and expressed in the midst of that speech, and shyness is classically understood to be one of the most charming ornaments on a woman, especially a young woman. So this, quote, soft and shy speech of a virtuous young wife is referring specifically to that experience of a newly married young woman just becoming to speaking to others outside her immediate family for the first time, and therefore doing so in a shy and charming manner. And also the fourth example, where the idea that the name of a lover is pleasing to proclaim, then the idea is that if there's occurred the type of viraha that's known as prabhas, or where there's one of the members is living abroad and there's been a prolonged period of separation, then when a letter comes or a message comes, then the in this case the wife or the lover who receives the message, then she doesn't just read it, but she's reading it aloud. She's singing it out to the tree under which she's sitting, or wherever she's privately getting the chance to spend time with this message. So just as she will take great pleasure in speaking out these words that she's received from her beloved, then he's saying, may I also in that way sing your name. May I also in that way feel such affinity for your name. The author's choice to use comparisons related to the attachment felt in the context of worldly, martial, and amorous relations may be questioned by some, considering that sadhakas may not find a verse that evokes remembrance of such objects to be in good taste or pleasant to contemplate, given that Sri Jiva in the aforementioned commentary spoke of, quote, the referent of the word woman as an object of utmost aversion. In response to this consideration, it can be said that the author's intention in making such comparisons may be for the purpose of writing a prayer that is relatable and appealing to those who have yet to feel such aversion as a result of the lack of discernment spoken of by Prahlad Maharaj in the aforecited verse of Vishnu Puran. So, right, he said, Ya pritir avivekanam, that this affinity for objects of the senses that the undiscerning feel. The implication being that the discerning don't feel that same thing. So if we look at it in that way, we can say that this poet, he's writing in this way thinking of an audience that isn't discerning, and therefore trying to, so to speak, reach them where they're at, and give them a way of praying to feel attachment to Bhagavan with direct reference to the actual attachment and pleasures that they do feel. Or it may be that the author, in the spirit of humility, wishes to indirectly allude to his own struggle to overcome his own attachment to such objects, as he prays to Sri Bhagavan for attachment to his prasad, lila, figure, and name. Or it may be that this bhakta wants to have this type of attachment to Bhagavan, but nevertheless still is experiencing the presence of samskaras that drive the experience of pleasure and attachment to those objects. And therefore he's speaking, so to speak, with reference to the struggles that he's having and saying, my psyche is still attuned like this, but I want it to be like that. In any case, a prayer to Sri Bhagavan of similar character and equivalent import can also be found in Padma Puran. So, Yuvatinam yatha yuni yutam cha yunam cha yuvato yatha manobhi ramate tadvan manome ramatam tvai. As the minds of young ladies delight in a young man, and the minds of young men delight in a young lady, so may my mind delight in you. Sri Sanatana Pad cites this prayer in Hari Bhakti Vilas as an example of a prayer suitable to be offered to Sri Bhagavan after the completion of one's daily practice of archan and japa. In the section in Bhakti Sandarbha about the limb of bhakti known as entreaty or vigyapti, the compiler also cites this prayer as an example of the category of entreaty known as, quote, that constituted of earnest prayer, samprarthanatmika. So there's three types of entreaties in the Sindhu, samprarthanatmika, lalisayatmika, and dainyabhodhika. So here, Rupa Goswami classifies this prayer of let my mind delight in you, as men and women delight in each other, that this is a prayer of samprarthana, or it's of earnest prayer, an entreaty of earnest prayer. So, in other words, I'm also just showing that prayers of this same nature, as is found in this verse in the Padyavali, are also found in the Padma Puran and also quoted by Rupa and Sanatan elsewhere. So, I'm a bit over time, pardon me, for that. But there's just one more passage that I have on this text. So just, if I can go just a couple more minutes, then we'll conclude the discussion of this verse. And this final point from the Bhakti Sandarbha is also quite relevant. So, in Bhakti Sandarbha, Sri Jiva Pad also refers to this prayer as a means of resolving the obstacles posed by one's bad inclinations, or durvasanas, and unwholesome actions, or dushkarma. So when one has samskaras for various types of material pleasures, then these give rise to these various types of inclinations, and when those types of those inclinations then give rise to actions. Now when those samskaras, vasanas, and actions pertain to things that are sinful or things that are detrimental to one's spiritual practice, then they're classified as du, meaning bad or unwholesome or unfavorable. So durvasana or dushkarma. So for those who struggle with such things, which, we hear about in the Prem Bhakti Chandrika, the prayers of Narottam, where he's saying, my life is almost coming to an end, but this durvasana still has not come out from my heart. So bhaktas may very much feel the presence of these durvasanas and at times also may unfortunately act upon them and engage in dushkarma in the course of their aspiration to follow the path of bhakti. So what can they do about that? How can they manage that, if you will? So these statements in Bhakti Sandarbha 217 are highly relevant in that regard. So, here in regard to the offering of natural karma, that is, the practice mentioned in Bhagavatam 11.236 and elsewhere, of offering to Bhagavan actions one is impelled to perform by one's disposition. So in other words, offering to Bhagavan the actions one feels impelled to perform, be they related to him or be they what we call sarup siddha bhakti or specifically acts of bhakti or not. So in other words, for the most part, meaning acts that are not, but saying, I did this, but at least here, I offer it to you. Something in that category. Then The approach is twofold in the case of unwholesome action. So there are statements where Krishna says, whatever you do, offer it to me. Okay, so what if I go and do some nonsense? Do I offer that to Krishna too? I remember getting questions from people saying, I can't stop smoking pot, but when I smoke a joint, can I offer it first to Krishna? At least I could think of Krishna and, be reminded of Krishna. So would that be good? So this is speaking to that consideration. So the approach is twofold in the case of unwholesome action. Or in other words, because of the way my psyche is inclined, I'm doing such and such things which don't have anything to do with bhakti, but I could still, after I do them, think, let this be offered to Krishna. But the act itself is an unwholesome action. In other words, it's immoral or it's of a tamasic nature. So should I offer it or not? So to that, Jiva Gosvami says the following. It is to be resolved without distinction for those desirous of gyan. So now he's first of all dealing with this as it pertains to those who follow the path of gyan principally, but may engage in some form of bhakti that is mixed with and secondary to their pursuit of gyan. So this would be called either, bhakti mishra gyan, or could in some cases also be called Jnana Mishra Bhakti. In the case of such practitioners, it can be resolved without distinction for those desirous of Gyan, that is, those whose aim is realization of unqualified Brahman, meaning followers of the path of Gyan, can offer their unwholesome actions to Bhagavan, just as they offer wholesome ones, without making any distinction between the two, since their practice is based on non-identification of themselves as neither the agent nor the beneficiary of such actions. So in the case of the Gyani, he's saying they can do that because their whole practice is trying to break away from the idea of identifying with any action, be it sattvic, tamasic, moral, immoral, whatever. They can just say, I let this all be to him because it's nothing of me. So for those who are simply trying to completely erode or erase the idea of being a doer of all forms, he's saying then detaching or disidentifying with the actions by offering them to Bhagavan is applicable for those following the path of Gyan. Whereas, point 2, for those desirous of bhakti, or followers of the path of bhakti, it is to be resolved with this prayer. Quote, as a result of seeing the suffering I am undergoing arising from my bad inclinations, may he who is full of compassion bestow compassion upon me. Or, with this prayer, quote, may all the attachment I have to wholesome action and unwholesome action verily in all respects become that the object of which is Bhagavan. That is, may all the attachment I have to all else be transformed into attachment solely to Bhagavan in accord with the manner described in the very verse we read earlier, the verse of Prahlad, from which Jiva Gosvami built his definition of priti. Quote, as I continuously remember you, O Bhagavan, may everlasting priti for you, which is possessed of a characteristic like the affinity which the undiscerning have for objects of the senses, never slip away from my heart. And in accord with the manner described in the verse we discussed earlier from Padma Puran. Quote, as the minds of young ladies delight in a young man, and as the minds of young men delight in a young lady, so may my mind delight in you. That is, in the case of those following the path of bhakti, unwholesome actions are not to be offered to Bhagavan. So he's saying, when it comes to unwholesome actions, then pray like this. So, in other words, he's not saying, yes, you can offer them. He's saying, you can pray like this, meaning don't offer them, instead pray like this. So in other words, his direction is different for the Bhaktas than the Gyanis. Instead, acknowledgement of them to him is made by means of prayers offered to Bhagavan. So there's a prayer which acknowledges the presence of the inclination or the action that may have been performed, but it's not an offering to him of the action. Rather, the kicker, the very important point is, but it's nevertheless allowing that unwholesome action to also be a cue to again think of and pray to Bhagavan. So it's, a little bit like the Aikido concept in martial arts, where you use the energy of the opponent to then exert leverage over the opponent, where the attacker, so to speak, is coming, and then with the force that he's attacking you, you move in such a way that you then absorb the force of his movement and then push it back upon him. So rather than, so to speak, trying to just brute force resist the attack, if you will, or resist the triggering of the samskar, the inclination that one feels, rather when it arises, then one is, so to speak, redirecting the mind from, following that vasana to turning back to Bhagavan and turning that negative inclination or unwholesome inclination into an impetus to pray to Bhagavan, into an impetus to again remember Bhagavan, in other words, into an impetus for bhakti itself. So in that sense, even quote-unquote, unwholesome inclinations or quote-unquote negative thoughts can also become cues or reminders or means by which one again turns the mind towards Bhagavan, again engages in bhakti, in as much as anything else can. And the art, if you will, or a favorable progress in one's practice is to develop this capacity to again and again redirect the mind and see how the different vasanas that pull upon the mind, how one can redirect the mind from their influence again towards something that is nourishing to the bhakti vasana. Because the whole name of the game, after all, in bhakti sadhana is strengthening the bhakti vasana such that all these other vasanas are washed away. So, instead, acknowledgement of them, meaning those actions or those durvasanas, is made by means of prayers offered to Bhagavan that are expresses of repentance, desire for compassion and forgiveness, desire to become free from the attachments and bad inclinations that beget such actions, and desire to have attachment in inclinations solely related to Bhagavan. For the desirous, that is, for those following neither the path of Gyan nor the path of Bhakti, however, there is no offering of all unwholesome actions verily in all cases. In other words, but if you're just pursuing material things, then you can say, oh, okay, I'll do some bhakti to get some punya to enjoy, and look, I can even do bad things, then perform an act of offering those bad things to Bhagavan, and then think that I'm going to get some punya from doing those bad things to then enjoy. No. Jiva Gosvami is not allowing that, so to speak. So that's beside the point. For the most part, what he's saying is that the bhakta won't directly offer their unwholesome actions, but they can allow those actions and the inclinations that give rise to them to be impetuses to pray to Bhagavan for attachment to him, engagement in activities satisfying to him, the nourishing of the bhakti vasana, the diminishment of those unfavorable vasanas, and so forth. So, back finally to our verse of discussion, when our anonymous poet is saying, let your offerings be for me pleasing to taste like the lips of a beautiful young woman, we can also understand that he may be wishing to imply, let me no longer feel the pleasure that I might feel in those lips, and instead feel that and all the more pleasure in offerings to you, which indirectly implies, let me have deep affinity, let me have anurag for you, and not for these objects of the senses. So let me have Bhagavat Priti and not Vishayi Priti, which again, in essence, as per Jiva Goswami's definition, is let me have this desire for you, which is an outcome of favorability towards you, which gives rise to experience of you and the elation of such experience. So, pardon me for going quite a ways over time, but that's a full discussion that I have at least on this particular verse. So from the next class, we can start fresh with the next topic. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, corrections, questions, or otherwise, please feel free to share at this time.
I was wondering, will you be able to elaborate on nature and the definition of desire? In my understanding, the desire is the function of an activities, and it has to, it's always motivated with the idea of obtaining the objective, right? So, and it's positive objective on result. So I was wondering how this converges into the discussion we had about, in context of Mahaprabhu's the verse that explains, whenever you take me, I still be there. I'm just limited now to speak, but
You've just gone a bit faint. I'm not able to hear the rest of what you're saying.
Oh, so okay, whatever. What could you understand from this?
I heard most of it, but then when you started to quote the last verse of the Śrī Kṛṣṇa, it went a bit muffled.
Okay, yes. So this last verse of Śrī Kṛṣṇa is in reference to my point, trying to understand what's the nature and condition of desire, or definition of desire. Is that
okay? So I don't know if I'm grasping the whole line of thought here, but you're asking what is the nature of desire?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And definition, like what constitutes? Because in the context of human activities, desire is done.
Sorry, in the context of what?
Human activities, the life itself, the desire is it's a foundation or essence of one's existence. So the same thing in bhakti, right? And I was wondering if you can elaborate on that.
Well, for the most part, I mean, words like kama, icha, Krishna, spriha, there's many synonyms we have in Sanskrit. They're, for the most part, considered like, blocks as opposed to composite elements. So all I can say is that if we look at how the word raga was defined here at the beginning in the Yoga Sutra as that which follows pleasure, then he defined raga as a desire for pleasure preceded by remembrance of pleasure of one who's had a past experience of pleasure. So we could also derive from that a definition of desire and simply say that desire is that which emerges when one has had pleasure and is the outcome of experiencing pleasure and then seeking to repeat the experience or have the experience again. So it's an outcome of a past experience. It's an outcome of a samskara, which motivates or drives the psyche to again achieve experience of that which created itself, or which created the samskara in the psyche. So if we define it like that, then it can overarch between both the material and the spiritual and shape be conceived as being present both in the psyche of Brajbasis, if you will, and of Sangsaris. So, is there anywhere you specifically want to go with this, or how does that sound?
Well, that's quite limited right now to discuss. We'll leave it as it is. I'm at work, sorry.
Okay. All right, well, then we can conclude here. So I'll just lastly say that the overall spirit of the verse is to, create some intensity of feeling, or, as, the world is, so to speak, driven by, the passion of romance and the passion of love in this amorous sense, that this is, the majority of movies that are in theater that has ever been made over thousands of years has some degree of this type of plot in it, almost without exception, then to say that this, driving force which animates people's lives and causes the perpetuation of species, that very force, that one could feel an intensity of that specifically in relationship to Bhagavan, and that it could be an expression of anukulya, of engagement that is satisfying to Bhagavan, then that would be otherworldly, or that would be the supremely wonderful state of being, which would be completely satisfying to oneself, all the more satisfying to its ultimate recipient, Bhagavan, and moreover satisfying to everyone else present along with. So this, most sublime state of love for Bhagavan, that is this, affinity for Bhagavan based on desire for him, based on favorability for him, based on past experience of his sweetness and so forth, that this is what is to be prayed for. This is most worthy of being a Odsukya Prarthana, or a prayer made with earnestness. So if we've been long conditioned beginninglessly in samsara due to principally the type of anurag described as in the example of this verse, then we can say if we've been here beginninglessly, it's then ultimately the highest urgency to pray and acquire the type of anurag that is spoken of here for Bhagavan. So in that spirit, we happily proceed through this section here on prayers full of eagerness for Bhagavan. And we'll look next at 2 verses of the Shikshastakam. The last 2 verses of this section are the 6th and then the 4th verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. So as we've done so far, as a little bit of an exception to the norm, the verses on the Shikshastakam, I give a little bit of a more extended discussion. So we'll begin discussion of commentary on the 6th verse of the Shikshastakam in our next go. So, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama, Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.